Coming up on this edition of Safari ChangeMakers.
Actually being able to make a difference. They decided to donate, I think it was a couple of hundred mattresses to this orphanage, which, they were obviously so appreciative of, and left a long-lasting impression on all of us, really.
This is Safari ChangeMakers. Conversations with Africa's most innovative visionaries, the guardians, pioneers, and trailblazers, offering solutions to the most pressing challenges facing the continent. Over-tourism, human-wildlife conflict, the climate crisis, and environmental degradation. Conversations that reveal bold strategies for sustainable tourism leading to economic opportunities for indigenous communities while protecting local ecosystems and wildlife.
I'm here today with James Suter, who is a filmmaker, guide, and what else? What else are you, James?
Yeah, well, I wear a couple of hats. I'm absolutely passionate about wild spaces and conservation, and through storytelling, through Blackbean Productions, which is our production company, we try and educate people about matters that are very important to us and important in the conservation sector using film as a medium. So I host a number of trips throughout Africa, and I also make films about stories that I feel very passionate about.
The one that we're talking about today is Edge of Existence. And before we go into that, I will say that James has also guided clients of ours, and we may touch on that because I think it's really interesting to look at how the clients experienced the trip that you led for us. What are your reasons for producing this particular film, Edge of Existence?
So this film was made a couple of years back now. We released it in 2021. And I think it was a story that was very close to our hearts. It's quite interesting. I think at that stage, even within the conservation circles, human wildlife conflict was certainly being spoken about, but not many people really understood it. And I think what we had hoped to do with this particular film is certainly talk to conservation and the challenges facing wildlife and wild spaces in Africa, and using essentially in this film the Serengeti as a microcosm for what's happening around the world, but also look at the people, try and create an objective film where you also see how people struggle living with wildlife on a day-to-day basis, and just asking the question in terms of what can we do so that we can safeguard both people and wildlife, while still educating the next generation about the importance of wildlife. And I think what we realized and what we took away from the film was that essentially if it doesn't pay, it doesn't stay. And people need to understand the value of wildlife. They have to place a value on wildlife to want to protect it. And I think another interesting thing in terms of working on this particular production was, as a production crew, from an emotional point of view, we were like a yo-yo, feeling incredible sympathy and passion towards people wanting to protect wildlife and obviously the environment that they inhabit. And then at the same time, interviewing a farmer who had just lost his entire year's crop as a result of elephants raiding his farms.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was, I'm getting goosebumps. It was an incredibly emotional journey for our production team. And as a guide, quite interesting to be out of the bubble, so to speak, where I've hosted so many clients. Most of the production was actually shot around the western corridor of the Serengeti, and to spend time outside in the communities and be exposed to what it's like to live in an area where we've got such incredible wildlife that obviously people from all over the world come to visit.
And I remember when I went to that area, focused on in the film, which is that Grumeti Reserve, I think that we were driving up from Serenera, and I think we had to go through a town to come in.
Yeah, I mean, it's very possible. You could have very well driven out of the Serengeti National Park and through a community before accessing the national park.
We did, for sure. Yeah.
and obviously the private game reserve. And I think what people don't realize, and it's a little bit of a different story where I live in South Africa, where we've got fences around our national parks.
Yeah.
But in places like Botswana, and in this case in Tanzania and Kenya, most of these areas are open systems, which means that there are no fences around the national parks. And often it's a little river or a drainage line or a depression that separates people. In the Western Corridor's case, it's about 80,000 people, and animals like elephants, lions, hyenas, leopards, potentially dangerous animals that live right on their doorstep. So that's something interesting to note, is that Tanzania has actually got a policy of no fences. And that was another reason for us making this film, was to ask the government, maybe consider looking at Kenya and introducing fences where you've got semi-porous fences where you don't restrict the movement of animals, but you do stop the big problem animals like elephants getting into the farmlands and obviously destroying their crops. And so that was a big part of what we wanted to do as well, is to ask the government if they would consider readdressing their policies that are already in place. And as a result, we actually had a 30-kilometer fence that was funded along the Western Corridor that Singita Grimeti Fund was able to erect as a result of this film, and obviously the great work that they do in the area.
Have you gone back and seen if it's helped the problem?
I have, and it's absolutely unbelievable. And I'm a huge believer in fencing. Obviously, they have to be constructed in a specific way. The last thing you want is for it to impact the movement of wildlife, because as you know, up in these areas, it's all about the allowance
corridors
of animals exactly to move, specifically in the Serengeti ecosystem. And so these fences have to be porous. And in this case, the biggest problem, like I say, are elephants. And elephants coming into a farmer's crop, like I say, that a lot of work goes into growing crops. I mean, if you're a farmer, you work really, really hard. And what we noticed with the guys who were working really hard, and then at night they had to stay up all night, literally watching their crops and making sure elephants didn't come in. And that farmer's crops was paying for his 4 or 5 kids to go to school for the year. And so elephants are a big problem. And obviously that fence, a 30-kilometer fence, which is not going to allow elephants to come into the reserve, or to leave the reserve and come into the farmlands, is going to obviously make such a huge impact, and has done so in this case.
So many questions I have and reactions. I mean, one of them is, why would they not want fences, the Tanzanian government? The other question, and then the other reaction was definitely watching the film and I started to say, I'm usually in the safari bubble along with guests, right, who we send. And from watching the film, there's no way that you cannot truly shift and have empathy and a much better understanding of what the effect of wildlife being right next to you has on these communities. I mean, it's the same as if coyotes jump over my fence here in Los Angeles and kill my dog, it's really hard to look at those coyotes as not as a menace.
I mean, you're spot on. Essentially, the Grimeti Reserve, what we wanted to do was use it as a microcosm for what happens around Africa, and certainly, in different cases around the world. Maybe to a lesser extent in LA, but it's and it's so funny that you use the analogy of obviously a coyote coming into your house, because it's the same for me. I started keeping chickens, and I was losing my marbles having to try and protect them from a grey mongoose, where I live in South Africa. I think to answer your first question with regards to why doesn't the Tanzanian government want fences, I think it all comes down to education. And I think what needs to happen is that, people in the space actually need to visit other countries and to see how things work in similar spaces. And obviously, the Serengeti Mara ecosystem, and a number of ecosystems in Tanzania and Kenya rely on open systems. You know, animals need to be able to migrate, they need to be able to move, essentially to survive, to find the food throughout the year. And I think that's a big question mark for the Tanzanian government, is that all of a sudden you put up fences, you're stopping the movement of animals. But again, it comes down, like I say, to education. There are different types of fences that can be built. There's strategic places where fences can be put up as buffers. There doesn't necessarily need to be a fence around the Serengeti National Park. So
not the whole park, but just
exactly,
a certain edge of the park.
100%, and really working as a buffer to just protect that particular community where you've got large populations of people living in areas where, ironically, the wildlife's actually increasing as a result of good conservation practices. And so you spot on, you know, looking at areas of interest where you could put up buffer zones to protect people and at the same time actually protect wildlife, because as soon as the wildlife is in the community, they're fair game. You know, the bushmeat trade is huge and people are hungry. And people are going to, you know, people are going to make a plan to hunt and kill that animal, not for their tusks or for their ivory, literally for food. People are starving on the boundaries of these national parks. So it's a very hard thing to tell someone who historically has been able to hunt in these areas for many years that now they're not allowed to hunt. And at the same time, they must tolerate these animals who all of a sudden have increased in number and are decimating crops or hunting and killing their livestock. But with regards to human-wildlife conflict, it's a massive problem. We've got an exponential growth in people. Most countries in East Africa are set to double by 2050. And then at the same time, we've got these incredible national parks and these beautiful wildlife areas and people who pay money to come see them and stay in lodges. And so you've got increasing populations of people, increasing wildlife populations, and obviously that's causing the conflict to increase. We're running out of space, and at the end of the day, like, what side are you going to pick? You're going to pick the community side, or you're going to pick you know, the animal side. You know, you've got a lot of people who are very quick to comment on supporting animals. You know, we refer to them as couch conservationists, and they don't have a perspective of how actually people suffer as a result of living so close to wild animals. So we wanted to obviously explore that. And try and put together a balanced film where, you know, both sides of the story was told.
I have a question with regard to the money piece. So tourism brings in a lot of money for obviously lodges and safari companies and all of us. Then there's park fees and conservation levies, which I think are meant to protect wildlife. Is some of that also something that could go to the local people from tourism? Is that something that is working in some places? Is that a possibility there in the Serengeti, or is it not?
I think that's a really great question. And I think that's where people like yourself come in, that understand the industry and work with essentially eco-conscious lodges where not only are they upskilling locals and providing them opportunities to have a job and to upskill themselves within a company, but also they've got programs where they reach out to the local community. You know, they've got outreach programs that focus on education. They've got programs that focus on small business development, which in essence can support the lodge, which are really interesting. And they've got conservation initiatives where not only is money put back into a fund to add to the conservation status of that particular area, but actually involving clients and developing conservation participation exercises where people from all over the world can participate and be involved in exercises when it comes to conservation. But in terms of upskilling the local community, like I said earlier, the community really needs to see the value of wildlife. That's, at the end of the day, they definitely need to be included when it comes to getting a slice of the pie, and benefiting from having these animals on their doorstep. What's been great to witness as a private guide and as a filmmaker who has traveled throughout Africa is there are a lot of very conscious operators out there, who realize that without the community, their model will not survive. And therefore, there's a huge effort in terms of, number one, employing from the local community and upskilling local community, focusing on the youth, with regards to educational programs, and at the same time making sure that the money that is being generated, from this for-profit organization, a community is also getting a slice of that pie. And that means, as a whole, the community sees the value of wildlife and sees the value of having that operator there, and sees the value of people coming from all over the world to experience what is one of the most magical experiences in the world. But in a number of cases with regards to conservancies, so pockets of land that exists outside of the national park, a lot of these conservancies, the land is actually owned by the people. And that is managed by, in most cases, a chief. And I think what is really great, and why I'm such a big fan of these conservancies, is that so often there is an arrangement between, again, these eco-conscious lodges, who invest in communities, and essentially pay a levy, to the landowners, which essentially is the community. And so again, they see a direct financial contribution as a result of them allowing for wildlife to thrive, essentially on their doorstep.
Another thing, I talked with Rob and Storm Mason from Kalepo the other day, and in addition to what you've just talked about, they also said that they set aside a small fund in case any livestock, I think, is killed, possibly by a predator or maybe an elephant. Have you seen that?
Absolutely. I mean, so we've worked, with a number of people around Africa, and obviously each area has its own unique challenges. Certainly with the high populations of predators in the Serengeti Mara ecosystem, and in other parts of Tanzania and Kenya, people get frustrated when it comes to their livestock, essentially being taken by predators. And so a number of operators and organizations have arranged what they call a compensation fund. And essentially what happens is, if there is a cow or a goat that is killed by a predator, together with local authorities, they will do an investigation, and that farmer will be compensated for the loss of his cow or his goat. Which definitely does help to mitigate conflict. And yeah, at the same time, there's some really interesting projects. There's another project we worked on called the Maasai Olympics. And this is a biannual event trying to change the mindset of Maasai warriors, not necessarily to compete with each other by killing a lion, but rather hosting essentially an Olympic event, or an event that resembles the Olympic, using traditional methods of competition, whether it's spear throwing, sprinting, high jump, to compete with one another and essentially continue their traditions without the killing of lions. So there's some really amazing people and organizations doing some fantastic work to not only mitigate human-wildlife conflict, but educate people and make sure that local communities directly benefit.
Do you think that these topics are front of mind for clients when they book a safari, or do you think this is something that they learn more about as they travel?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think it obviously depends on, how often clients have visited Africa, because as you know, once the bug bites, they're coming back. But yeah, I mean, 100%, when you're booking a safari, I think, what's front of mind is how quickly you're going to tick off the big five, and, who's going to be hosting you and what is the lodge accommodation going to be like. But I think what's so exciting about being on a safari is, I mean, without sounding cliched, it really is a journey. And it's a journey of discovery. And it's not necessarily just about finding wildlife and ticking off animals. It's so much more than that. And I think that's what makes it so exciting. And I think it's incredibly important as a guide, not just me as a private guide, but as local guides, to be integrating kind of awareness into the safari experience, and to be talking about conservation and talking about their culture and talking about their challenges. And I really think that's so key. And so guides, I think, play a fundamental role in being that segue between what a guest is experiencing, whether it's, you know, a lion stalking a warthog, but also what it's like growing up in a community, you know, on the boundary of the Southern Serengeti, what it's like going through initiation as a Maasai warrior. These are such important points, and, you know, from personal experience and how I try and, I guess, add value to trips when I'm on the ground, is introduce them to people, because, you know, people, you know, those are the people that you're going to remember, and the resources that you have on the ground really kind of can make or break an experience. And it's so interesting, you know, people think that they're going on safari and they think that the highlight is going to be, you know, seeing a leopard sitting at the top of a tree or the migration crossing the Mara River. But so much more often than not, it's sitting around with a local chief in their local manyatta, in the heart of Maasai land, or meeting a woman that's gifted one a necklace because we made the effort to go see her homestead. And, you know, these are the kind of experiences that I think people really thrive off. And I think it's really important. I think a safari is an education at the end of the day. And you're not just going on safari to tick off animals, but you're going to learn about another country. You're going to learn about their challenges, the culture. What's so exciting is that so often people visiting these areas are in a position to actually support and help. And that's where the magic happens, because they end up getting involved. I've just had friends of mine donate a bus to a school in Rwanda, and that's all this needed to change the life of these school kids.
Last year, when you guided the big family for us, we started in a more typical safari area. And I think that's because when we're creating these kinds of trips, we can't just take people to very remote areas. I think we need to combine them with a little bit of the more, I guess I would say, typical before you go off to a really remote place like Chilo Gorge, or in East Africa, like up in Samburu land where Kalepo is. You certainly could just take clients to those very remote areas that are not as touristed, but I think they do kind of want to go to the must-sees as well. But a lot of those photos that were really the most impactful seem to be when you went and visited local people.
It was unbelievable hosting this multi-generational family that you had sent on safari. And although it was a big group, it was just awesome, because, you know, we had obviously a lot of different ages and personalities to engage with. I don't know if you remember, but initially we started in Johannesburg, started in a big city, and I think, you know, they literally came from obviously living a pretty comfortable life in the US to being thrown into what was, I think, a really eye-opening experience for them in Joburg, where we visited a township. It was completely safe, but at the same time, we really got an idea of how some people live in South Africa and the disparity between the really wealthy and really poor. But then at the same time, all the good work being done, and just the atmosphere of the community, and how South Africans, you know, band together and make the best of life. And I think that was such an interesting interaction that we had as a team. what was so nice about that particular trip from a wildlife and a landscape perspective is spending time in the Sabi Sand. I think on the first safari that they had experienced, we obviously got to see some amazing animals. Animals are incredibly habituated to the vehicles there, and we just had some absolutely magic sightings, from leopard to lion to cheetah, elephant, buffalo, you name it. And so we almost got so spoiled that we got it out of our system in a way. We had seen everything they could have ever imagined seeing. And then what was a really nice touch is we spent time in a local orphanage, and we've got a whole bunch of kids. Let's start off with a game of soccer. It's a universal language. So we just had at it, and we played soccer for about an hour and a half, and eventually had to tell the kids, listen, we've probably got to call it quits at some stage. But we just had such an amazing interaction with this these kids from this orphanage in a very, very rural setting.
That's just so different than sort of the performative way that sometimes people see culture, where they're sitting and people come out and start dancing for them,
Exactly.
and they take 3 pictures and they buy 2 bracelets and they leave. I know that those people in the Masai Mara, in those villages, and, all the ladies standing at the border with all of their wares and such. I mean, they're doing it for a reason, but it's not necessarily working real well, I think, for guests who really want a deeper experience. I don't know. I don't know if there's a solution to that issue. I just think it's part of the responsibility of maybe all of us or the governments to figure out different ways to support people again through tourism.
Definitely. It's so true. And I mean, as a private guide, you're so often that segue between either making or breaking an experience. Obviously, there's a lot that you can do with regards to putting together a trip, but so often it's difficult because you've got 2 different cultures, and you're wanting to create some commonality, and for it not to be a situation where it feels almost contrived. But I think it's all about whoever it is, whether it's the local guide or private guide, or the operator who has the opportunity to have met some people who offer a slightly different experience. It's a challenging one to manage, but it can be managed in the correct way. And when it is managed in the correct way, it's probably one of the most unbelievable experiences one can have on safari. Forget the wildlife, but actually connecting with local people and the happy faces of kids, even though they've got absolutely nothing. And then, like I say, if there is interest, actually being able to make a difference. And one doesn't realize, like, just such a small gesture can make such a big difference in Africans' life. Again, just to your point, I think, again, you're so right. There's so many community tours which I would avoid like the plague, because it does feel contrived. It is a performance. And sadly, that's just because it's been done for X amount of years, and no one's actually broken or mentioned that, it actually doesn't work well this way. It's just kind of like a well-oiled machine. And sadly, this is a way that a lot of people are able to make money. They make beads and goods that they can sell. Often there's a community fee that's paid to a community if there is some form of interaction with the community. So they are benefiting. It's just managing that experience. And I think having people on the ground to help steer that experience is kind of what makes or breaks an experience, to be honest with you. And
True.
I think the case of playing soccer with these kids worked out so well that, like you say, they decided to donate. I think it was a couple of 100 mattresses to this orphanage, which, they were obviously so appreciative of, and left a long-lasting impression on all of us, really.
More safari.
Talking about Chilo. So when we get people to places like Chilo Gorge, Kalepo, very off the beaten track, how can we, do you think, sell places like this better And I'm just using those two as case studies, but
you're almost taking a bit of a risk when you're, going off to these far to reach places. You used Gonorrhoea and the northern parts of Kenya as an example, where you've got these very remote locations where, often people sadly don't visit because they're not on the safari circuit. Using gonorrhea as a case study, it was super interesting with this group as well, who incidentally, for most of them, it was their first time on safari. And so coming from the Safari Sand, where, they obviously experienced just incredible wildlife, as a guide, it's not hard to disappoint there because there's just so much happening all the time. And then going to this vast, wide open landscape of Gonorrhoea. Initially it's so interesting watching kind of guests' expectations, because they start off thinking, flip, where are all the animals, or why are things so different to the Sabi Sand? And by day 2, day 3, they've kind of really understood that they're now in a really wild, raw, untouched paradise. And it's amazing to kind of see that transition where they almost start, feeling like the Sabi Sand was a little bit contrived compared to the wilderness area that they've been immersed in, and kind of see the mindset change. But I think places like Gilo Gorge get it really right, because what they do is it's a real, raw and authentic experience that is set in the most unbelievable landscape. And you've got characters that are able to talk to the area, the history of the area, the wildlife, the people. You've got amazing interactions with the community. And you're almost having this authentic experience that you would have had, decades ago in Africa. And I think people are after that. I think, there's, and I'm not taking anything away from these incredible properties that are frequented by international visitors. But I think there are some real gems whereby they are off the beaten track, but they really do have so much to offer. The footprint is a lot less. They are incredible storytellers. And, essentially with a lot of these properties, you'll find the owner is managing the camp at the same time. So you've got this you develop this incredible relationship with these owner-run properties, making the trip and the experience really extra special.
When you said that the clients by like the second day sort of understood, did you just intuitively feel that, or did they say anything specific that you can remember? Like, what makes you think they got it?
It's such a good question. And I mean, as you can imagine, you're a fly on the wall guiding a big group like that. So you pick up on a lot. It was amazing with this particular group, who had an incredible time in the Sabi Sand and some phenomenal wildlife sightings. I think just to see the level of appreciation for an area like Gonorrhoea, which I think even for a guide like myself was quite a novelty. It started off with just picking up on the appreciation, people talking about how incredible the landscape was, to how interesting it was seeing how the elephants reacted so differently because they so seldom see people, to, crossing gigantic rivers, to not seeing another vehicle. And, very quickly, I think people relate to that and are drawn to that wild experience. And so I think someone did allude to the Sabi Sand, which is definitely not the case, feeling a bit more like a zoo compared to where they were at in Gonorrhoea, which was this wild, raw, incredible wilderness.
Yeah, that makes sense. And interestingly, when planning that particular trip, the grandmother who was the leader, she was remembering back to a trip she had taken like 30 years ago when she was younger, very, very wild in Tanzania. And she sort of challenged me and said, but I'm sure there's nothing like that still. And I want to take them to Southern Africa. I'm sure there's nothing like that in Southern Africa. And I said, well, there is. you know. But we also had to balance it since her grandchildren had never been there, and to be able to go to a place like the Sabi Sands. And I hate to say it, you know, have people tick off the box, but they did,
Yeah.
you know, so that then when they got to Chilo Gorge to get that deeper experience with the people, which she really wanted for her grandchildren. And when you went to that village, you spent time with them. Again, it looked like there was a lot of kids playing soccer.
Yeah. Yeah. I
It's
mean, yeah,
like the universal language.
you're spot on. And I think that's where these trips work so well, is where you can find these kind of contrasting properties that offer these different experiences. And you know, for me hosting that trip, it was such a pleasure because I enjoyed the contrast so much. And you know, you do have areas where you can get very close to wildlife, and they are relaxed with the vehicle, and then have that complementary offering of a place like Gonawajo, which is this incredible national park with very few people. And obviously a historian like Clive who knows the area so well and owns the lodge. But yeah, such a different experience. I'll tell you a funny story. Probably the first time I've ever pulled into a wild dog den sighting where we've actually had to drive through the community to get to the location of the wild dog den site. And as you know, wild dogs are probably the most successful predator that we have in Africa, but they're also incredibly endangered. But it was just so funny and in a way so apt, especially with Clive's program, because he obviously works so closely with the community, that to get to a wild dog den site, we had to drive through the community. And the community, as a result of Clive's great relationship with them, look after the dogs. And even though they hunt goats and, you know, give them a headache from time to time, they're compensated and they tolerate these dogs. And they realize having these dogs here brings tourists to the lodge that they work at, brings tourists to their community where they're able to also benefit from. And yeah, I just found it like quite a magical experience to kind of be driving, and you know, I had to pinch myself a couple of times, you know, driving through this community to see one of Africa's most endangered predators, you know.
That was on that trip. Yeah.
That trip.
Yeah.
And again, just the interaction with the local community, you know, the kids in that case were actually teaching the local kids a song that they sing in the States, and that was a huge hit. They were teaching the kids how to throw an NFL football. We went to a school where once upon a time the blackboard was this old ebony tree. And you could see, you know, that where the teachers had used the trunk of the tree as a blackboard, a temporary blackboard. And again, I think there was an opportunity where the guests were inspired to support, you know, an initiative that they really felt strongly about.
I know that when you made the film Edge of Existence, you had it come out right around the time of COVID. So this is just back to the film a little bit.
Yeah.
And you probably had big plans for it to be sort of shown, and then COVID hit. Have you been able to kind of get it back out there again?
No, well, yeah, it definitely was not planned to release, you know, during COVID. And I think what made it so challenging is obviously we had gone the festival route, which, you know, you do with most films when you're wanting to really get a critical mass of people to watch it, you know, eyes on the film. And sadly, at that stage, a lot of the festivals were virtual. But we were incredibly fortunate. You know, we had a lot of international broadcasters take it on. We had it on Showmax for a number of months, which is a big platform here in Africa. And it did really well on the international film festival circuit, which was great. And at the end of the day, our objective was to educate people about human-wildlife conflict.
With the exponential increases in game, we now see an increase in human-wildlife conflict. The competition for space and resources between people and wildlife.
There are no fences between the reserves or protected areas and the villages, so there's free movement of animals.
A damage made by elephants.
We are called to intervene when elephants are wreaking havoc in farms or there is a potential for carnivores to attack livestock.
Species like buffalo and hippo posing a direct threat to human life. The baby lost consciousness when it was hit by the buffalo.
Villagers, they view wildlife as the threat to their livelihood. Animals are just creatures, they can go to hell.
The devastation grows exponentially when you are speaking about one individual whose farm is completely flattened just a few weeks before harvest.
People are starving on your boundaries. When enough is enough, guys start taking the law into their own hands.
Community, government, and conservationists, all of us have a role to play.
Humans and wildlife can coexist.
So yeah, it was a tricky time, to be honest with you, to release a film. It was our first stab at a feature-length film. You know, usually we're in the game of producing shorter format films.
Yeah.
And like I say, it was an incredibly emotional journey to be a part of, in terms of just seeing how people live, and at the same time, obviously, empathizing with the wildlife that are affected. And what we also did is we made a film for the Grumeti Fund. So it was more of a scripted piece to use as an educational tool in Tanzania. At the same time, obviously managed to raise funds for that fence, which now sits on the western side of the Grumeti reserves. And for me is such an important tool to mitigate human elephant and human wildlife conflict.
Have you ever shown it here in the States or in Los Angeles or New York?
We've had a number of screenings, and the one really exciting screening was at the Explorers Club in New York. That was really special. We work very closely with a 501c3 because we've also got a non-for-profit organization where, you know, we refer to it as film philanthropy, and we work as filmmakers to empower organizations that we believe in on the ground. And often that's in the form of grants, so people funding a film so that individuals and organizations who are doing incredible work, mainly in the conservation and humanitarian space in Africa, can have a presence online and can have a beautiful piece that's produced on what they're doing and the importance of what they're doing. And so that's a big push for us at Blackbean Productions, and the organization is called Connect. And then we've got a number of documentaries that we're currently working on now. We like to keep ourselves pretty busy, so there are a number of films, mainly again in the conservation and humanitarian space, that we're busy working on. One involves mental health and how animals adapt to, you know, various stressful situations, and looking at how people can essentially learn from animals. Another one is The Last Elephant. We've got one elephant that's left in the Knysna forest. Again, sadly, as a result of human wildlife conflict. Can you imagine that there's just one elephant left in this wilderness area?
That's like up on the Eastern Cape?
Exactly it. So just before you get to the Eastern Cape, there's an area called Knysna. It's absolutely beautiful. And she's situated in the Knysna forest.
One last elephant. Wow. So if people wanted to watch that film, how can it be seen?
Yeah, there absolutely is a way. What's quite exciting now is, I mean, obviously the film, like I said, was released 3 or more years ago.
Right.
So it is dated, and our agreement has now lapsed with our distribution partners. So there are 2 ways. We're going to be popping it up on YouTube in the near future, and alternatively, we'll share a link with a password. So, we'd really encourage anyone who's interested in the subject matter to give it a watch. It really is an important piece, in our opinion, and a very interesting subject to learn more about.
It has some disturbing elements, but I think that's key, because otherwise you wouldn't understand what's really going on. For people that are interested, to be able to watch that before they go to Africa would be quite interesting.
Like you said, it is quite a hard-hitting documentary, but it's amazing. And I've showed a lot of clients, a lot of guests who have visited the Serengeti game reserves, the film actually while on location, and it's amazing. Like, they actually can't believe that this all place in the Grumeti reserves and obviously the adjacent communities. But I think you're right. I think it's a really important film to watch before you go on safari. And I think, again, talking to what we were chatting about earlier, safari is an education. It's not just a holiday, it's a working trip. And at the end of the day, you end up learning a lot, not just about the environment you're in, the people that you meet, but about yourself too. And so definitely worth a watch and educating yourself before you hit the ground running.
Well, that would be great if we can get some way of sharing that, because I know people, after hearing about this, will be interested in being able to see it. So James, how do you fund films like this?
We do a lot of commercial work, which is obviously paid for, and we play quite a bit in the commercial space. We do a number of pro bono films, which are often funded in the form of grants. And then bigger films like these are essentially passion projects. And I think where we're so fortunate is there are so many people who realize film is such an important tool to educate people. And I think where I've been so lucky is, as a guide, I've had the opportunity of meeting people who resonate with the type of material that we produce and the stories that we tell. And a lot of our films have been funded by people who are just absolutely passionate about getting a story across the line. And so with some of our films as well, we put together a pitch, and we are supported by networks, which will then obviously release the film on their platforms. But the conservation and humanitarian stories, we've been in the game for, I guess, the last decade and a bit. We've made a bit of a name with regards to working in that particular space. And I think we've got a bit of a leg to stand on when people are or show interest in potentially funding a film. And people have been incredibly generous and supportive, and I think see the value of using film to educate a big audience.
Well, you've got to come to LA and show it in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Film capital of the world here.
And I've never been to LA, and I hope to get there next year. So that would be fantastic. And obviously we'd love to see you in LA as well.
See if we can figure out a way to get some people who have some influence to be able to help, the work that you do.
That would be amazing. I think geographically, being a South African, it's very limiting in terms of the access you have, referring to LA being the film capital of the States. We're a little way away. And I think that's where it's just been so amazing, obviously, as a guide, connecting with people, like I say, who sometimes are in the film industry and are in the position to help us make these projects come to life. And so we're very grateful.
Well, thanks, James.
Well, that's our show for today. Subscribe on YouTube and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Till next time, I'm Karin Jones.